And to move on to another sort of act of barbarism, sustained multiple acts of barbarism over many decades, the grooming gang scandal is back in the spotlight. The latest is that Jess Phillips, the Labour Minister for Safeguarding, it's just being reported she took the decision in October not to hold a government inquiry into the grooming gangs in Oldham. She said that the local council should hold an inquiry instead, even though the council feels that the government should step in. But this has now caught the attention of Elon Musk. It's caught the attention of the whole, essentially, the whole of X has been discussing the grooming gangs issue for pretty much the past few days. Tom, I mean, this story, there have been many inquiries. There have been many reports into the various cover-ups. And yet I think the thing that's missing is not the inquiries, it's the action, or the change, or the justice, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I think the outrage directed at Jess Phillips is not necessarily because people are convinced that a national inquiry is the one thing that we need, or although many people are making that case quite powerfully. It's the fact that it indicates a certain lack of seriousness with which this issue has been taken by the political class in general, but by Labour in particular. It's worth remembering that when this scandal was first kicking off, it was Labour MPs like Anne Cryer and Keithley who were sounding the alarm about this in the early 2000s, and who were dismissed as bigots parroting BNP propaganda, effectively. It was Labour MPs much more recently like Sarah Champion, who was kicked out of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet for raising this particular issue. And I think the reason that this has exploded so much is it seems to have suggested that the Labour Party isn't that interested in this. You've got a figure like Jess Phillips, who his entire political career really has been about the question of violence against women and girls. She's now the safeguarding minister, as you say. And yet I think it's fair to say that she has, shown remarkably little interest in this industrial scale rape and abuse of young, particularly working class girls across the country. And also, I think she's got a bit of form for ignoring scandals like this, issues of sexual violence, when it's politically expedient to do so. I mean, I'm reminded of her comments after the Cologne sex attacks, New Year's Eve 2015, 2016. She went on Question Time and appeared to downplay it by saying that's something that you'd see in Birmingham Broad Street every Friday or a Saturday night. It referred to the widespread reported sexual harassment, even rape of women by predominantly migrants, as akin to being heckled on the street. And I think you put all those things together and you get a big scandal. That plus the fact that Elon Musk seems to be having various kind of horrendous injustices in the UK brought to his attention and bring a tremendous spotlight to them as he kind of finds out about them 10 or 15 years after the fact. So it's all of those things mixed together, I suppose, kind of quite aside from the question of what form an inquiry should take. I think it just indicates for many people that the political class in general, but the Labour Party in particular, have never wanted to look at this issue for longer than 5 minutes.
And Joe, it seems to me the reason the political class are so uninterested in this, or perhaps even why it was covered up for so often and in so many towns, is that it's both the wrong kind of victim and the wrong kind of perpetrator. Almost, it doesn't fit the narrative that they like to promote.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this very much connects with the story we've just been talking about in relation to terrorism. It's as if there's two parts to this. I think there's a real fear of being labelled as racist, of not wanting to label who the perpetrators were here, which is mainly Pakistani men, mainly Pakistani Muslim men, Pakistani heritage men. They don't want to go there. They don't want to label that group. They want to stay away from any fear of being called racist. But the flip side to that is a fear of the general public. It's an assumption that if we hear that these crimes were perpetrated by Pakistani heritage men, that the general public will somehow flip out and go and, riot. And, I think the irony is, though, the more these things do get covered up, actually the more angry people do become about it. And, if we had been able to have a conversation about this, if there had been some form of inquiry, again, this is something which is going back over 2 decades at least. If this had been discussed 2 decades ago, rather than people being shut up at that point, people, I'm sure, would still be angry, but it would be out there. It would be something that could be discussed. But just on the inquiry, I actually think it's really, really important that that does happen, because I think the reason why people are shying away from it is that whilst this stays a local issue, a matter for Oldham Council or Keighley or Rochdale or Middlesbrough or any of the other towns, Oxford, where this has happened, it can be put in a little package as a small local matter. And I think what's happening now is people are really trying to say, well, let's join the dots up here. Let's look at the extent to which this was actually a national problem. This was happening across the country. This was not a little local matter, but this was something which was actually far more widespread than that. I actually really think J.K. Rowling is right yet again on this as well, that the word grooming is a bit misleading. These were, many of them were children under the age of 16. And when you look at some of the new reports that are coming out about what was actually happening to these girls who were below the age of being able to legally consent to sexual intercourse, this was rape. And it needs to be called that. These were rape gangs, and this was happening systematically across the country. And I think that was, shocking, terrible that this has happened. But the fact that it's been covered up, the fact that we've had stories about fathers trying to remove their daughters, young daughters, 11, 12 years old, from such situations, and finding that they were being arrested for racial abuse. I mean, that's just horrendous.
And in some cases, girls being arrested for being drunk and disorderly after being victimised by this. And Tom, I mean, I think the fact that they're working class girls as well has played into this, because the police often seem to view them, in some cases, as nothing as prostitutes almost, even though they are children.
No, absolutely. And in many cases, this isn't necessarily even just working class girls we're talking about very poor girls, many of them going through the care system, which again kind of doubles the sense of injustice here, that these were people who were very much in touch with the authorities, and yet nothing was done. If anything, they were often arrested, as you say, treated as, I think in the Telford report reference, the authorities treating them as common prostitutes when these are girls of 13, 14 years old. It's absolutely shocking. The one thing that I'm, not to sound too cynical or pessimistic, is you almost feel like whatever happens next in terms of an inquiry or another set of investigations, that unless we change something about how we talk about this, and unless the political parties are sufficiently incentivised and pushed to do something about it, it will probably be another kind of talking shop in which we're told lessons will be learned and then nothing really will happen. Of course, this has been covered up for a very long time. Some of the reports point back to cases stretching right back into the 1980s. In Telford, they suggested, horrifyingly, the abuse had become generational. You had a mother and a daughter being subjected to the same horrendous rape and sexual violence. So it has been covered up for a very long time. But I am struck by the fact that people in public life have been talking up about this for more than 20 years now. If you go back to Anne Cryer in the early 2000s, Andrew Norfolk began writing about this in the Times around 2011. We have had this series of reports, some of them specific to a locality, some of them more broad and general, and yet it never seems to have any consequence. The mainstream media does talk about it for a day and then moves on. Politicians will talk about it for 24 hours and then move on. It never has any political consequence for all of the reasons that we've talked about, the sensitivities therein, and also because of the fact that it would allocate a hell of a lot of blame to many, in many cases predominantly Labour-run councils, and raise questions about their own complicity in all of this. So until that changes, until there is more courage, more bravery, more genuine accountability, whatever inquiry takes place, you fear it will end up like all the other ones, kind of just gathering dust on the shelf rather than anything actually happening as a consequence.
But I do think on that, it's really important to give a kind of hat tip, if you like, to GB News, and particularly Charlie Peters from GB News, also spiked columnist in the past.
Former spiked interns, I always like to point out.
Spiked interns.
People do great things from Spike.
But, I think it's a lot of it, at the moment, the reason why this conversation is coming to the public's attention, and it has broken through, not just on X, but in the mainstream media now as well. It's been on the Radio 4, leading the Radio 4 news bulletins twice today already, is because of the determination. But I think just on what Tom was saying, a number of people we know in high profile positions in Britain would sooner see GB News shut down altogether. The amount of censorship and the amount of kind of condemnation of people for even raising these issues, and the slur that if you raise this issue, you're automatically racist, or there's some kind of conspiracy theory there, and that's why you want to do it. That's part of the problem that we've been up against. And, I think it's really, good that this is at least now getting a proper, thorough public airing. So it seems, at least for the time being.